welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our special guest and a great friend of this program and of the network, Dr. Scott Hahn, talking about his book, Many Are Called, Rediscovering the Glory of the Priesthood, and is published by Doubleday. Welcome, Dr. Hahn.
Good to be with you.
You don't have to be introduced at all, obviously, considering even on this program, we're talking about having done about 17 books over the years.
Wow.
And what year was the first year you actually came to EWTN?
1991.
1991.
Yeah, about 5 years after I came into the church, and now I'm celebrating a quarter of a century of being a Catholic. And
right, so that's exciting. About 20 years or so. Let me ask you, before you came to EWTN on your journey, did EWTN have any impact on that journey?
It didn't, because I really was studying Scripture and the Fathers, and I wasn't even really aware of Catholic answers or the contemporary apologetics resurgence that was just beginning at the time. But once you enter the church, it didn't take long before I found out about EWTN and all the other amazing organizations like Catholic Answers and Ignatius Press and so on.
Right, and back in 1996, you and Jeff Cavins did Our Father's Plan, which was the first series you actually worked on for us. And then subsequently, we had a wonderful relationship over the years between you and Franciscan University, a series of programs, a lot you've done with Mike Aquilina.
That's right, right.
It's been a nice cooperative effort.
At least a half a dozen programs on various books that I've, 13-week programs.
Well, let me ask you this question. You said many are called, and it says, rediscovering the glory of the priesthood. Was it lost?
Well, I think it was eclipsed. Eclipsed by scandal, eclipsed by the confusion that came with the sexual revolution in our culture back in the 60s, and even eclipsed by the general malaise that set in the 70s. I don't want to go back and rehearse the crisis. I think for the most part, we're seeing the church really emerge with great graces. But I think what happened, especially for me, was Benedict calling the year of the priest. And I just thought, this is providential timing, because this is the time where we have to really pick up the diamond, blow off the dust, and recognize this is what a gift God has given to us in the priesthood of the new covenant.
Let me ask you, sometimes the Holy Father has done that, certainly during, our late great John Paul II had the year of the Holy Spirit. And some people on the outside might kind of say, did these things really do anything? Did that help the priesthood, help people understand the priesthood? What was the benefit of having something like that?
Well, I've been teaching in seminaries now for many years, at the Josephinum in Columbus, 8 or 10 years ago, and I've been at the St. Vincent Seminary now for the last 6 years. And I'll tell you this much, it had a huge effect on young men considering the priesthood. But it also had a tangible effect upon priests themselves, who really needed that kind of encouragement and support from on high, from the Pope, as it were. And I remember when the announcement was made by Pope Benedict that this would be the year of the priest, 1 week later, it was on retreat. And at the end of the retreat, it was as clear as anything had been that I would get now to write a book that I had been talking to Doubleday about for 5 or 6 years. I'd wanted to do a book on the priesthood. But ever since the scandals back in 2002, they were like really skittish.
I was going to ask you where they were a little...
leery.
So you're going to write a positive book about the priesthood?
Exactly. And so I called them on the way home when I was driving back from Indiana. And I talked to my editor, Gary, and he was enthusiastic about it. He wasn't just open to the possibility, and he was sure that others would be too. And they all were. And so, my premise is this, that I've talked to so many young men over the years about the possibility of being priests. And, time and again, I'll encounter this response. Well, I'll be honest, I don't think I'm called because I really don't feel any attraction. And my response is this: if you don't feel any attraction to the priesthood, that is no sign that you're not called. It's just a sign that you haven't understood the priesthood yet. Because the priesthood is intrinsically attractive. It has an inherent desirability that once you understand it, you might not be called to it, but if you're not, there will be an element of regret. Because once you see that your manhood will be fulfilled by God supernaturally, not repressed, that, I think, is the door that opens up for a lot of young men to realize, okay, sacrifices are definitely in order. I'm going to have to give up marriage and family life. But you end up experiencing a degree of fatherhood that isn't less, but arguably more than most dads ever do.
Well, one of the things you just mentioned there struck me, and you talk about it in the book. You talk about the masculinity of the priesthood.
Oh, yeah.
Is that something we need to re-emphasize?
Oh, I think it is. I think because of all of the media misperceptions and distortions, but also because of the cultural pressures that are on ordinary Catholics growing up in America in the 21st century. I think we have role models like the one I used in the beginning of the book, Father Joe Freedy of the Pittsburgh Diocese, who was a star quarterback for a major university football team in New York. And, I heard the story after it had happened, but his father gave him a copy of the Lamb's Supper. And when he
read,
that was the book. That was the book. I didn't want to refer to my own.
You were very humble. You didn't mention what book. Well, I wanted to ask you what book that was.
Yeah, well, when he read the Lamb's Supper, he called his parents and just said, if this is what priests do on earth, they bring heaven down to the people of God. I'm laying down my playbook and I'm picking up the good book, And he really got a sense of calling to the priesthood when he realized what a unique power is conferred upon a priest to bring Christ. And not just to bring Christ to us in the Eucharist, but to bring all of heaven down to earth and to lift earth up to heaven.
Now, the foreword is by Archbishop Timothy Dolan. He talks about, obviously, his own experiences, saying, ever since I was a boy, I recognized there was something unique about priests. I knew they had great responsibilities, goes on to say, because they were Jesus's men. Now, you talk about your growing up in an area where there was a fair amount of Catholics and Catholic parishes. What was your impression of priests before you became Catholic?
Well, it's sort of like it's sort of like standing on the sidewalk and looking at the stained glass windows of a Catholic church from outside. You're like, okay, whatever. They say they're beautiful, but it just sort of looks, not that great. And so for me, the priests of the Catholic Church were just sort of like alien beings. I just didn't have anything to understand. And because I grew up in a nominal Protestant family, it was even, it was twice removed. When I became an evangelical, I remember thinking, okay, so the Apostle Paul was celibate. That doesn't mean, all of the rest. But what happened to me, in fact, you mentioned Archbishop Dolan. We were together at a conference on vocations at the University of Notre Dame. Our good friend John Cavadini was sponsoring this. And I gave a talk on the vocation of marriage. And I stuck around because Archbishop Dolan was coming to give a talk on the vocation of the priesthood. And then we had dinner afterwards. That talk left me in tears. And a lot of men who listened to Archbishop Dolan, I couldn't wait to thank him at dinner. And he said, oh, it's funny, because all I did for this talk was, I did my holy hour last night before the Blessed Sacrament, and I had a pad and a pen, and I just reflected in the presence of Jesus on what it's meant for me to be a priest. And I'm like, that explains it. Because supernatural grace was flowing through the profound natural rhetoric that you presented. But it was just the kind of joy that he exhibited in the priesthood. That's what I began to detect when I started meeting priests. I don't know why, but the first 2 or 3 priests I met when I was a Protestant struck me as being no less manly than me and no less fulfilled than me. And so when I began to dive more deeply into the Bible, and especially the Old Testament, where priests are called fathers and fathers are seen to be priestly, that's when I began to realize there's a convergence here that these men tap into, even if they can't explain it academically.
Well, it's interesting. I'm thinking of Archbishop Dolan, thinking of Bishop Sheen, of course, and the Holy Hours. And I think of how important Eucharistic adoration has always been to Mother and the sisters here, and how that really has expanded out again and gotten very, very popular with Holy Hours and things, and how important that is. Well, Archbishop Dolan says that, really talks about how you focus on fathers as protectors and providers for the people of God, that's what priests are. Let me ask you, because you also kind of juxtapose being a Protestant minister versus the priesthood.
Right.
When you first became Catholic, did you see that distinction that greatly? Have you come to understand it better?
Well, to be honest, I had experienced this as a pastor. In less than 2 years of full-time ministry, I'd already begun to feel a sort of tug of war between my natural bride and my parish, which kind of felt like a demanding bride on her own. I remember hearing from a number of Protestant pastors over the years how we felt like bigamists, that we were married to 2 brides, and that there was a kind of tension that was ongoing. And I also remembered when I left the ministry as a Protestant, as a Presbyterian minister, coming to a new appreciation, not only in terms of theology, but just in terms of personal experience, as to how much sense it makes for Catholic priests to be celibate, because they've got 7 sacraments, not 2. and they have so much more of a role in the lives of Catholics than I did in my own congregation with parishioners.
And in many cases, dealing with a lot more people, right?
That's right. I mean, hearing confessions, especially. I mean, just being available for that kind of spiritual counsel and sacramental grace.
When you were a pastor, what was the largest church you actually pastored?
It was. It started off less than 100, and then it began to grow quickly. And I'll be honest, it was precisely because it was growing so quickly, and people were so excited about my preaching. That's what made me very wary, because I just kind of felt the force of my own fallibility, wondering, okay, is this going to end up a personality cult? Let's pull the plug before it goes too far.
In your section, Measures of Manhood, where you talked about Joe Friede, and you talk about our male role models, and you talk about the idea of athletes and rock stars, you say, don't get me wrong, I have nothing against professional sports, rock music, or the free market. I'm an avid fan of all three. Is it okay for a priest to be an avid fan of those things?
Well, I think so. I believe that, you can be supernaturally natural, as priests often are. And so they have tastes in music, they've got favorite sports teams, they've also got an interest in the economy and that kind of thing. It would almost be unnatural for them to be so exclusively supernatural that they didn't really have, as Pope Benedict says, we've got to have our head up in heaven, but our feet firmly planted on earth.
You said, I thank God for the fatherhood he has conferred upon me, yet I believe that he has conferred a more perfect and ultimately more fulfilling fatherhood on Joe Friede and those he has called to the priesthood. He's the football player who became a priest that you mentioned before. Sometimes people see that and they say, well, it's very hierarchical. You kind of have this class system inside the church. Is that really where we are with the people of God these days?
Well, I mean, if you're going to compare the priesthood to, say, the military, high command, well, that's the conclusion you'll reach. If you even compare it to a business corporation with a CEO, you're probably going to come to a similar conclusion. But if you see it in terms of the family, then you realize that leadership in the family is all about sacrifice and love. In the first place, the middle place, and the end place. And for me, fatherhood was the mystery, because God is a father, and I am too. So when we hear that God is a father, we think we know what we're talking about. But this is where the theological principle of analogy comes in, because analogy recognizes similarities between creatures and the Creator, but even greater dissimilarities. And so you have to say, okay, if God is a father and I am a father, what does that mean? Well, we think we know what it means, because to be a father, you've got to have a male gender, you've got to have a body, you've got to have a particular organ, perform a particular act in a particular marriage. And yet, God does not have gender, he doesn't have a body, he doesn't have an organ, he doesn't perform an act, and he's not married. So therefore what? He's not a father? No, he's more of a father than I am. So we have to purify our notion of fatherhood and see that it's not primarily physical, but spiritual. It's not primarily psychological or human, but divine. And once you recognize that God's fatherhood is perfect from all eternity, then you can see how men like St. Joseph end up as fathers closer to God. And as St. Thomas Aquinas points out, the human father in a natural family is the instrument of natural birth, human life, whereas the priest is the ordinary minister of baptism, and as such, he is the instrument of supernatural rebirth and divine life. He communicates fatherly, a much greater life than I do to my kids. And that's why in the Catholic Church, we call them fathers, not because they're like fathers, but because they participate in God's paternity more than I do, not less.
At the end of chapter 1, you say, we'll trace the story of salvation history, highlighting the development of fatherhood and the priesthood as God's people try, sometimes succeeding, sometimes failing, to live out those roles. If we understand fatherhood and priesthood from God's point of view, we'll be better equipped to help men discern their vocation. Now, it was interesting in reading through the book, in a sense of how the priesthood kind of did develop, right?
That's right. People don't recognize this, but if you go back to the Old Testament, you can see it very clearly. Just compare Genesis to Exodus. In Genesis, who is building altars, offering sacrifices, and pronouncing blessings? The patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and others. Why? Precisely because they're patriarchs. In the patriarchal period, the patriarchal family was the church. That was true all the way through the first half of Exodus. When God brings Israel out of Egypt through the Passover and the Exodus, all 12 tribes were to be consecrated, as he says, to be a kingdom of priests until the golden calf. When the 12 tribes fall into idolatry and apostasy, there in Exodus 32, Moses cries out, who's on the Lord's side? Well, the Israelite men, especially the firstborns who had just been redeemed by the Passover, should have said we are, but instead the Levites did, Moses' own fellow tribesmen. And so because they're the ones who burned with zeal for God's glory and took out the idolaters, in Exodus 32, Moses declares, today you've ordained yourselves to be priests. So from that point on, the Levitical ministry, the Levitical priesthood replaces the family form where the patriarch as a father would pass down to his sons, and especially his firstborn, this capacity to lead in worship and to offer sacrifice and to pronounce blessings. That was originally a fatherly role, and then it's assigned to one tribe, the Levites. But to show that the transition is not an easy or smooth one, it didn't happen quickly. In the book of Judges, I point out in Judges 17, 18, and 19, you have this episode involving a man named Micah who appoints his own son to be a priest in a domestic chapel. And then along comes a Levite passing through town. And what does Micah propose to the Levite? Why don't you be to me a father and a priest? He doesn't have to explain to the Levite what that means. He just assumes that the Levite already knows. And the Levite becomes sort of like the chaplain of Micah's domestic chapel. And then some Danites are passing through town. They find out about this shrine, and they approach this Levite and say, what's better, to be a priest over one family, over a whole tribe? Sort of like a parish versus a diocese, you know. Why don't you come to us and be a father and a priest? And I remember as a Protestant, what struck me was just how commonsensical it was for both Micah and the Danites to propose to the Levite that to be a priest is to be a father, and to be a father is to be a priest. That priesthood is the spiritual component of fatherhood. And I knew that from my own experience as a dad, but to recognize that the family of God is not a natural human organization, but a supernatural divine organism, all of a sudden I'm realizing this is why they're fathers. This is the essence of the priesthood. It's spiritual paternity.
That's chapter 3, actually, spiritual paternity. At the end of chapter 2, you say a priest is someone who mediates between man and God. A priest is someone who offers sacrifice. Now, as a Protestant, isn't that a problem?
Well, it is, because we basically ascribe that to Jesus, that he is the only high priest. And so he mediates between God and humanity. Well, as Catholics, we would affirm that too, that Jesus is the only high priest. Like Aaron was in the Old Testament, Jesus is even more in the New. But just as Aaron, as high priest, had other priests, his own sons and all of the other Levites, who participated, who shared in his priestly ministry, so likewise we discover that Jesus gives us the Spirit so that all of us through baptism participate in his royal priesthood. But there in the upper room, when he institutes the New Testament by saying, this cup is the blood of the New Testament, the New Covenant, he goes on to say, do this in remembrance of me. And at that moment, he is instituting the Eucharist as the high priest offering sacrifice, but he's empowering those apostles, even as he's commanding them. If they're going to do this, if this they're going to do is a sacrifice, then what he's conferring upon them is a share in his own priesthood. And so when you recognize that Jesus being the only high priest, like Aaron was, that doesn't exclude other men from being priests who are subordinate and yet who also share in his ministry.
In the section here, a priest forever, you make the comment that you are, as a Christian, baptism's character is permanent, and you say that sacrament of holy orders, he's changed forever. And obviously we've had a lot of issues in the last number of years here. You say he may be an immoral priest, or even if the church has disciplined him, a defrocked priest who may longer celebrate the sacraments or be called father, still he is a priest. Why is that important for us to understand?
Well, because, this idea of sacraments of character, there's a Greek word, charakter, which is an indelible seal, a stamp. Baptism confers this character so that when you drift away from the church and you might wander far away, when you come back, you're not rebaptized. Just like if my kids run away from home and are gone for a long time, when they come back, they don't need to be rebirthed, they need to be reconciled. And so sonship is something that is indelible for my kids, especially my 5 sons. Well, fatherhood is also indelibly stamped into my being. I mean, if I, for some reason, just left home or was gone for a year, or if I drifted off, the fact is they would still see me as a father. If I'm faithful or if I'm unfaithful, I'm still father. And so we recognize that God uses frail instruments, mortal men, to confer the bread of life upon his family. He overrides their weaknesses. He makes up for what they lack. He gives them all that they need so that they're able to minister, as we say, in persona Christi. They don't look up to the sky and say, this is your body. They don't look out at the crowd and say, this is his body. They look out and say, this is my body, because they belong to Christ in a way that is utterly unique. If they conform themselves to it, that's the fast track to holiness. If they don't, we got to pray for them.
Well, it strikes me, it looks like you were involved with naming some of these subheadings here, like calf-hearted.
Yes.
And this one struck me, profits and losses. And what struck me about this was, you talk about led by such delinquent mediators, the people strayed further from God and further into sin. And you have a whole section here from the prophet Hosea. So the question, what struck me, which was good in a sense, is that by doing what you did, it showed that just because people were priests didn't mean they did good things.
That's right.
But it didn't mean just because they fell that the Lord turned his back on his people.
That's right. The crisis in the priesthood is nothing new, because the crisis in human nature is nothing new. And priests are human. So in the Old Testament as well as the New, you see many priests fail. And in some generations, it almost seems like a disproportionate number do. For example, Hosea. Hosea is decrying the situation up north in Samaria. And he basically sees that the collapse of family life up north corresponds to the collapse in priestly holiness, like father, like priest. And so if you've got lousy families and fathers who are sort of adrift, don't be too surprised if you're struggling to find holy priests.
Now in this chapter, born to be a breadwinner, it's in our time, and this kind of dovetails into that, the hunger for the Eucharist is as overwhelming as ever. Many people, however, have been hungry so long, they no longer feel the pangs. They are starving for the gospel and starving to know the scriptures. So you're saying that, in a sense, they don't even realize that they miss it anymore?
Right. I mean, this is a kind of spiritual numbness that I have found setting in among Catholics, especially when they've stopped going to church, when they've stopped attending Mass, when they've drifted off, they've taken up an invitation from a neighbor or a friend to attend some independent Bible church down the street. And when you talk to them, they'll say things like, I wasn't being fed. And I'm half tempted to say, you've got to be kidding. You were being fed. You might not have appreciated steak and lobster like little kids don't, but don't say you're being fed now because you're getting all of this sermon-centered religion that is really like fast food. I don't want to say it's junk food because some of these homilies might be great, but the fact is the Eucharist is the bread of life, and this is the new manna of the new covenant that Jesus promised. And it's much more than any sermon could ever be.
In the chapter, Go Teach All Nations, you make that it's good for a priest to study sacred icons. Why?
Well, because an icon reminds us of what difference the incarnation makes. In the Old Testament, there were no graven images. Well, what's the difference from the Old to the New? Well, as Paul explains, Christ is the image of the invisible God. So Colossians 1:15 shows us that when that which is spiritual has taken on matter, that which is spiritual has become physical, all of history changes and our relationship to God changes. And so suddenly not only the body of Christ, not only the face of Jesus, but the saints who are in Christ, who are now in heaven, those icons are like stained glass windows into heaven through which we recognize that our older brothers and sisters have gone before us, and these icons are constant reminders to us that we must get home to heaven.
As we wrap up, until kingdom come, you say priestly celibacy is an outward sign then of Christ's total commitment to the church.
That's right. In heaven, Jesus says we're not going to be married or given in marriage, but that's not because marriage is bad. It's because we're going to pass from temporal marriages into the marriage supper of the Lamb. Christ, the bridegroom, sacrificed far more than I ever have for my bride. And so the reality of marriage is precisely what Christ has brought about, not in spite of his celibacy, but in and through it.
Who's Monsignor George Yance?
Oh, he's my pastor and has been for well over almost 2 decades. And he is a very, very dear friend and a spiritual father to me and to my kids.
How long did it actually take you to write this book?
It took me, in some ways it took me 10 years, in other ways it took me 10 weeks, because I had been giving these talks so many times to priests, to deacons and seminarians, that when I sat down it just flowed out of me. But that's only because I'd kind of worked and reworked this many, many times.
What's new for you? What are you working on? What's your next book?
I'm finishing up a Romans commentary, and I've just sent off a Chronicles commentary, and then I'm also doing one for Doubleday called Angels and Saints.
Okay, sounds good. Always a pleasure to have you here, Dr. Hahn. Great. Keep up the great work. Speaking here with Dr. Scott Hahn, author of Many Are Called, Rediscovering the Glory of the Priesthood, and it's published by Doubleday, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. Join us next time, right here on EWTN's Bookmark.